good sound system. All right, 2007. So that was a good year for me. That was for music. That was the first year that I was ever paid to play a show. Here's a picture from that show. I was wearing a cut-off Pokemon t-shirt, as was the style at the time. I think we got paid like $50, and there were 3 kegs of beer, so I was basically rich. And it was really important to me because I've always wanted to play music, and I had never gotten paid to play my own music. I'd like done some cover band stuff, but this was like music that I had written with friends, so it was original music. Also, that same year, I became a community DJ for this station, WHUS 91.7 FM. I had the 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. shift when I started, which is, prime time. I eventually moved up to 5 to 8, which was great, actually, because that was like the drive shift. So I would get a lot of calls saying, hey, this is garbage, or like, hey, this isn't music. But I would also get calls that was like, wow, I can't believe this can be music, because I played mostly experimental stuff, and those calls were great. I also love the ones that were hating on me, too, so whatever. Last year was also a really good year for me. That year, my band that I helped start, called Eastern Hollows, we put out our first LP, and we scammed a record label in England to actually put it out for us. So, I got someone to pay for that record, and I never thought that would happen in my life, that someone would actually appreciate my record enough that they would want to pay to put it out. This is our record release show that we had last year. We have I don't know if you see, this is our band Horse. His name is Stuart Copeland. When you release a record, you have to do a lot of weird shit, like sit in the woods for no reason and have people take pictures of you, or go on rooftops and pretend to play instruments that aren't plugged in when there are no amps. I also do computers a lot. This is me doing computers. I was probably debugging a test suite at that point. I currently work for Boku, and before that, I worked for Mozilla. And I like this progression because we've learned that dinosaurs are more closely related to birds. So I'm just moving down the evolutionary chain as in my career. And both companies are really passionate about open source. And in open source, contributors are everything. And I want to talk about a little bit about a band that recognized that. So, as some of you may recognize the logo, this is Black Flag. They were an American hardcore band, started in the late 70s, active through the 80s. And this is the lineup that most people know. That's Henry Rollins in front, wearing the T-shirt of his own band. Just a faux pas, if you ask me. He also has a tattoo of his own band, too, which is, I think, double faux pas. But this was not the original lineup. In fact, this wasn't the original lineup either, but this was the lineup before he joined. And this guy up in front, his name is Des Cadena. And he was the singer before Henry Rollins joined. And he was actually a fan of the band before he joined. They got him to join because their old vocalist was addicted to coke and not very good. So they got him to join, and he rapidly went into touring, went a year hard, year straight. Hold on. And kind of started throwing out his voice. He wasn't a trained singer, so he was really pushing himself a little bit too hard. During that time, they were having correspondence with Henry Rollins just as a fan. He was just a fan of theirs in Washington, D.C. When they were going to tour the East Coast, they decided to play an impromptu impromptu show at a bar, where he showed up to, and he was in the crowd, having a great time, and he was asking them to play this song, and at the set, they were like, hey, why don't you come up and sing it? We know you know it, it's one of your favorite songs. And so he did, and he got up there, and he did an amazing job. And he didn't know this at the time, but Des was looking to stop singing. His voice was shot, he just wanted to focus on playing guitar. And so when Henry got up there and did his thing, they were like, this guy's amazing, and they basically asked him to join the band on the spot. They're like, why don't you do this instead of me, because I'm sick of this. And he was just cool, and just jumped in the tour van and started going with them. And of course, this makes me think of open source. Because contributors are everything, and Henry recognized him as a valuable contributor, and so they basically gave him commit access to Black Flag. And it's, that's something that's pretty hard to do. Like, a lot of us kind of guard our commit access to our repositories. We want to hold on to that control. And there's a project called, it's the LevelDB project. And they have this philosophy called open source, where anyone who makes a significant contribution gets commit bit, like pretty much immediately. And I like the quote that they said that the project is more like an open wiki than a standard guarded open source project. And that's amazing to me. It shows like a level of trust that they have in their community, and their willingness and ability to communicate their shared values so that their project doesn't get destroyed. So honor your contributors. Moving on to the next section, I want to talk about a little bit about innovation through limitation. And in this section, I'm going to talk about Brian Eno. So those two tracks that I kind of crossfaded there, they came out about a year apart, and they're wildly different. The first one, Brian Eno came out, he was first in Roxy Music, and he came from the art rock, sort of glam rock scene. And that first track was kind of more of his style. And then something happened that made him have a bit of a musical epiphany and then released this album. He got into a really bad car accident, was in a full body cast, basically couldn't move, was in the hospital. And as he was in the hospital, he had a record that he wanted to put on, and he was able to get up and go and like amble over to the record player very painfully to put it on because he desperately wanted to listen to music. Being in the hospital is super boring. He needed something. He throws on this record, puts down the needle, and goes back to his bed. He's exhausted from just the struggle of doing that. And as the record starts playing, he realized that he didn't really turn up the record player, so he could barely hear it. And he's just like, fuck. Laying in bed, it's like raining out, so he can barely hear like the record. It's just like, it's this 18th century harp music, so it's just kind of like, and he kind of was despondent at first, but then he's like, well, I'm in this situation, I'm just gonna live in it. And as he listened to it, and the rain is going on, and he's in the hospital, and he's in pain, something clicked in his head. He was just like, this is music. Even though I can't hear what the artist intended, like the combination of everything that's going on in this room right now, this is music. And through that, he kind of pioneered ambient music and released this album, Discrete Music. And of course, this makes me think of CSS Zen Garden from 2003. I don't know if any of you know what this is. I feel like some of you do. When this came out, it blew my mind. Because, that was back during the days of table-based design and, image maps. We had all really gotten pretty killer with spacer GIFs. And so when CSS Zen Garden came out, and I saw what CSS could do, let me explain CSS Zen Garden for those of you who might not know. It's one page, it's HTML. You are not allowed to change the HTML on the page. You are only allowed to change the CSS. And it started off with just 5 designs, but they were all radically different. And so going through these, you're like, oh my God, this CSS can do this? I don't need to just use tables for everything? And it kind of blew open my mind on like how to do web design. Like it made me start thinking about how to separate my markdown from my like visual layer. And I actually, the site is still up, and you can go to them, and they still have all the old designs. So I was like going through while I was writing this and like picking out some of my old favorite ones. I love this one because of the star-nosed mole in it, and also that they assumed that horizontal scrolling was a good pattern to use. And this one as well. It was the early 2000s, so can you blame us? And so yeah, I going through all these old designs really brought up a lot of nostalgia. But yeah, creativity and innovation through limitation. CSS Zen Garden was like my first experience with that, but we do this all the time, and we have like JS1K contests, we have C obfuscation contests, like imposing some limitation on yourself to like build out some creativity and build out some innovation. I think it's a good thing to do, and we should think about that more as our computers get more powerful and just take more and more advantage of that. Like think about limitations and use those limitations to inspire your creativity and experiment. And speaking of experimentation, I want to talk about another artist, John Cage. who you may recognize here. Wait, hold on. There we go. That's John Cage. But I do want to talk about Nick Cage for a second with this. So this is apparently what Nicolas Cage's face sounds like, according to the Lincoln Motor Company. It's pretty nice. You could so it's interesting because I was Googling pictures of Nicolas Cage, and I found this picture in an article that was just putting a bunch of his faces through this. And this one was my favorite one. The music is actually kind of in the same lineage as Brian Eno, that sort of ambient lineage. But the first time I tried to record this, I had my computer settings fucked up, and I want to play you that version because I find that one interesting as well. And you can see me panic here and try to figure out what the fuck is going on. It turned out that I had set my... so what I was doing is I was setting my input to record from my output, but when I did it the first time, I forgot to turn off the monitoring, so the input was sending what it was hearing back to the output, which we know of as recursion. So be careful with recursion. Make sure you have end conditions. Unless you want feedback. Feedback can be useful sometimes, but in that case, actually, if you ask me, that's more what his face sounds like, so whatever. Anyway, back to John Cage. John Cage was an experimental composer from America in the 20th century. And I want to talk about two of his works, or two things that he did that was important to me. 433. Does anyone know what 433 is? Yes, nice. So 433, for those of you who don't know, is a composition by John Cage in 3 movements where the musicians in the piece set down their instruments and don't play for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. So ostensibly, it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, though John Cage would argue that. The inspiration for this piece, or at least one of the inspirations for this piece, is John Cage went into a soundproof room. So it was sound isolated from the outside. What is happening? Sound isolated from the outside, and on the inside, it was... They kind of made the room so there were no sounds. All the sounds would get absorbed by the wall, so there were no echoes. So the idea is that you would go into this room, and you would sit there, and it would be totally silent. And so he did this. And what he heard wasn't total silence. He heard a high tone and a low tone. And so there was the guy who was monitoring the room or whatever. He came out, and he's basically like, dude, your room's broken. And the guy was like, no. So the high tone that you're hearing is your nervous system, and the low tone that you're hearing is your circulatory system. And this blew John Cage's mind. He's just like, oh my God, even in a place that's completely silent, there is no such thing as silence. So there can be no such thing as silence. And this was actually a very comforting thought to him, and it kind of helped him embrace the concept of death, because he's John Cage. So I recommend you all look up this piece and look up the research on it. He considers it the most important thing he's done. Another thing that he did is called prepared piano. So this is a piano that has a bunch of screws and clips and things in it and nuts and bolts. And the idea is that, you can hear some, it changes the timbre and the tone of the notes that you're playing in a specific way that the person who composes the prepared piano piece intends. So this isn't just a random placement. These are very specifically placed for this piece. And he wrote a lot of compositions for this. He wasn't the first to do prepared piano, but he was the first to kind of make it popular, you know. And if you were to read Piano, the Good Parts, chapter 1 says, don't stick a bunch of garbage in piano. And I'm glad he didn't listen to this, because it went on to inspire some other people you may know. So that's Velvet Underground. And you can hear in the background John Cale, who's playing piano. He's actually using the prepared piano technique. He uses a bunch of paper clips. It's very subtle, but it's in there. And he was inspired by John Cage. And if John Cage had listened to Piano the Good Parts, he would have never invented prepared piano. We would never have Velvet Underground, and music would be dead as we know it. So, I mean, I do respect Douglas Crockford a lot, and I love the good parts, and I love what it did for JavaScript. It really brought it to people's consciousness as not just a toy language, but something that can be used in a professional context. But I also want this book to exist. I'm also really proud of this Photoshop, so just take it in for a while. But yeah, don't forget like the weird parts, and don't forget to experiment. Just, fuck around, use with, use eval, use eval in with. Get wild. Yeah, so just remember that like programming doesn't always have to be about bottom lines and stuff. You can use it as art. And I want to do a little bit of related pandering because like as a musician, you're always supposed to pander to your local audience, and we're in Norway, so I want to talk about a guy that I actually found out while researching this talk. This guy, his name is Bjorn Fongard. Is that okay? Cool. And I copied this from Wikipedia because the English Wikipedia doesn't have the actual dates, and I'm assuming this is the 2nd of March. To the 26th of October. And so he was born in Oslo, and he studied in Oslo. And he kind of invented the prepared guitar technique, same sort of idea as prepared piano, but you're jamming stuff under the fretboard and in between the strings. And he also liked to use a bow, and he invented like different types of guitars to play. Like he did a lot of cool stuff with guitars. It's not very well known. I didn't even know about it until I started researching this talk because he used this like experimental notation and he didn't have a bunch of his work recorded. There's just been one like retrospective of his work released pretty recently. But this is a lineage of like doing prepared guitar and like playing with a bow that like leads to some of my favorite artists. One of them being Sarah Lipstate. She performs under the name Noveller. These amazing soundscapes, completely solo, using loop pedals and delay pedals, reverb and bow, and all sorts of amazing stuff. And she's amazing to see live, and the nicest woman. I highly recommend her music. But you should explore what inspires you and look to your primary sources. So like digging through, like look at what you listen to now, and like look at what inspired them, and then look at what inspired them. I want to talk about a tech example that I found out recently, JSX, which, some of you might be throwing up right now, I'm sorry. But JSX, the idea is that you're able to just jam some HTML right into your JavaScript and it'll figure out what to do. But when this came out, I thought that this was something that Facebook had invented, but really it came from, like Mozilla is actually to blame for this, because it came from a previous spec called E4X. Which was ECMAScript for XML, because back in that day, you were just jamming XML into everything. So read this blog post, because this is one of the guys who works on React and JSX, and he talks about how JSX is basically just a distillation of E4X into what he thinks the good parts of it are. So that was something I learned actually just a couple of weeks ago, and that was interesting. And I love going back and finding those kind of primary sources of technology that we use. There's a great community that does this. It's called Papers We Love. They go through and read these academic papers where all this knowledge is locked up and most of us aren't reading it. Like, for example, like MVC has been around since like 1979 and we keep reinventing it every 3 years. Someone should just read the paper and stop. I also noticed there's no Oslo chapter, so you native Norwegians should get on this and start this. But yeah, go back and read your primary sources. I need to do a better job of this. We all need to do a better job of this. I want to take you through a musical example of that, kind of in reverse order. I'm going to start with like the earliest source I can find and move towards a song that you all probably know.
Maybe my last time, maybe my last time, maybe my last time, maybe my last time, I don't know.
So this is an old gospel standard. This may be the last time. It's firmly in public domain. Nobody knows who the first person to sing it was. There's been thousands of recordings of it. This is the earliest one I can find. This was, I think, recorded in the 40s. There was a more popular version that came out a decade later by this group.
This may be my last time. This may be my last time, children. This may be my last
Staple Singers. That was them posing with Don Cornelius from Soul Train, which awesome. Then after this was recorded, another group heard about this 10 years later, and you've probably heard of these ones.
But you never listen to my advice. You don't try very hard to please me. With what you know, it should be easy. Well, this could be the last time. This could be the last time. Maybe.
So the Rolling Stones heard the Staple Singers version, and they were inspired by it. I mean, you can hear it in the guitars and, of course, the vocals. And they admitted to being inspired with that. And they were also very happy, they said, that it was in public domain because they did not want to get sued. Then the next year, a different version came out. And this one actually might be closer to the point where you might be recognizing where I'm going to. So Andrew Oldham was the original manager and one of the early producers of the Rolling Stones, and he released a record of a lot of Rolling Stones songs reinterpreted with orchestral organization. And of course, you may have heard. The Verve, I mean, this was one of the most popular songs in the world at the time. It was rated 392nd on the 500 greatest songs of all time by Rolling Stone, number 9, 150 best tracks of the past 15 years, nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Rock Song, and they lost to Alanis Morissette. But out of all of that, The Verve made $0 from that song. Because they were licensed to use 5 notes of that Andrew Oldham version, and they used more, even though they re-recorded it. It doesn't matter. They were only licensed to use 5 notes of the composition. When they were recording, they played around, and they realized that doing a little more would sound better, but they never renegotiated their license. And when the song started blowing up, the rights holder, who was not Andrew Oldham, but a different person, saw an opportunity to cash in and sued The Verve, where they had to settle. The options were remove the song from everything, remove it from the album, kill it, or give me 100% of the proceeds. And they decided to do that. So this is a lesson in recognizing the risk of not respecting licenses, which I've been on teams where they're like, oh, let's pull in this GPL code. And I'm like, do you realize what that will do to this project? And they don't. So learn your licenses, learn the repercussions, because you may lose all of the proceeds to your very valuable song. The last section, I'm taking inspiration from this article written by Divya called Burn Your Idols. I want to talk about one of my favorite albums by one of my favorite artists, and then kind of skewer it. So this is My Bloody Valentine. This is the cover to their album Loveless. Came out in 1991. I heard it in 2003, and it blew my mind. I didn't even know what to think of it. Like, I didn't realize that pop music could do this or be that. All the vocals are buried. You can't understand what they're saying. The guitar sounds like it's going in and out of tune. but like the album would get stuck in my head, not just songs, but the entire album. And this was like a super inspirational album for me and for a lot of other people as well. Brian Eno actually said that this Soon off of this album was one of the best pop songs that he had ever heard. But in recording this album, Kevin Shields, who was the band leader, I mean, he basically destroyed lives to do it. It took 1.5 years to do it. It took over $250,000. He was alienating his band. He wouldn't let them into the recording studio. He would re-record their parts. He had to work with over 19 engineers to get it done. The 27-year-old co-label manager started going gray because of the stress of dealing with Kevin Shields through the process. And I mean, it's conflicting to me because like I love the end result, but like there was a huge human cost to get there. And I think of this article that came out recently by this guy Boz. He was an engineer at Facebook. It's called Be Kind. I encourage all of you to read it if it's the only thing you take from my talk. And Boz was a principal engineer at Facebook. He worked on Timeline. Fantastic engineer by all rights, and he gets called into his boss's office, and he's being told that he's being pulled off the project. And he's like, oh, why am I being pulled off the project? And the answer is because no one wanted to work with him. Even though he was an incredible engineer, his method of getting to the right answer, even though that was something they all wanted, I mean, it had a human cost. He wasn't nice. He would kind of skewer people to get to his end result. And this is something we can't do in tech, you know, or anywhere in our lives. Like tech, I think we kind of think of ourselves as like hyper-logical and that we're above that, and we're totally not. Like this is a completely human field. We're dealing with each other as humans. We're building products for humans. So let's think of each other as humans and realize that like we have to be nice to each other when we're doing this. Like we have to work with each other. It's not just code. Like the people part of code is more important to me than the code part of code. So yeah, think about this when you're programming, and think about this when you're getting to like the right answer. Like you all may want that right answer, but think about the path to getting there, and think about your shared values with each other. I mean, part of the problem when Kevin Shields was recording Loveless is that I don't think that, I mean, they all wanted the best record possible. They wanted a perfect record. But they didn't have shared values on how to get there. And after that record was released, you know, he was kicked from his label, he was dropped, and he started trying to work with the band, and they didn't want to work with him anymore, really. So he started recording in his room, and he ended up throwing out 2 full records of material, and it took him 22 years to come up with a second record to follow up Loveless, based on his own kind of perfectionism, but based on also because nobody wanted to work with him. So think about that. Like, think about your shared values with the people that you work with and the people that you hang out with and the people in your community. And sometimes it's important to make those shared values explicit. Like, you know, a lot of us think that people just share our values by being around us, and that's not always true. So. Thank you for going on this mostly self-indulgent journey with me. This is my musical bibliography.
My playlist for the plane ride home.
What was that?
I think that's going to be my playlist for the plane ride home after the conference. So, one of the things that struck me is that when you were talking is that music and tech seems to go together.
Oh yeah, totally.
Like everywhere I go, there's a band, basically. Why is that?
So I explicitly didn't answer that in my talk because I don't know. Part of it I think is there's a mysterious logic to music, like the way certain notes fit together, the way certain patterns of notes fit together, in the same way that there's a sometimes mysterious logic to the way that computers work. So I think it sometimes draws some of the same minds. Also just damaged people, you know. We all need to be damaged to work in music. We need to be damaged to work in tech.
Yeah, I sort of agree, because I think a lot of time that metaphors from music fit what we do a lot better than metaphors from engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of interesting to see that coming up in a few different contexts with very different people lately. I also triggered on something you said about creativity through limitations. I think that's a really interesting concept.
Yeah, if we just have open field to do with whatever we want, for me, I have paralysis of option almost. Like, I don't even know where to start. But like, if I know kind of my boundaries, I can start from somewhere and then start testing those boundaries. I mean, I think about the web browser. Like, the web browser was not intended to do any of the shit I just made it do. Like, it was a document viewer, and then people started, like, that was the limitation, and then they started pushing those limitations. So using, like, that sort of that box that you're given as your framework for starting to build something, it's helpful for me.
There's a lot of people who just wants you to shut up and take their money and write the JavaScript, the weird parts.
Sure, yeah, let's do
Yeah,
it.
I think you should do that. Just pop it on Kickstarter, and we'll all support you on that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, because
I'm going to use that cover, though.
I think that would be a great book,
Thank you.
and I would buy that. So there wasn't really a lot of questions for you in the Twitter feed, just a lot of praise.
Oh,
so you should
thank
go
you.
and read that.
Thank you, Twitter.
We're going to have a short break.
Can I nap on this couch while that happens?
Yes.
Cool.
Why not? There will be a short break now. There is going to be a quiz. Microsoft has organized some sort of quiz in the chill out area. So there's a lounge downstairs. Thank you.